Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the National Podcast. Today, I am sat down with Professor John Curtice, Professor Sir John Curtice, the eminent polling expert. I'm sure he will need very little introduction to our readers, but welcome. Thank you very much for
No,
joining us.
nice to be here. Thank you. First time I've been in this office.
Yo, it's a new studio, so hopefully it won't be the last time that you join us either. Well, depending on how today goes, we'll see. So I just mentioned just before we turned the cameras rolling there, I wanted to start today just rather than talking about this eminent expert, Professor John Curtice. I'd like to know the journey that kind of brought you here. Like, what first got you interested in polling in the first place?
Well, I can't give a terribly good explanation, but I will give you such explanation as I can offer. So my first political memory is 1963, age 9, coming on 10, with the death of Hugh Gaitskell as the then leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition. Um, and I kind of got fascinated by the fact that there was this election going to happen, which eventually Howard Wilson won and he became Prime Minister 12 months later. So that very much got me interested. There was, of course, also at the same time a substantial drama within the government because Howard Macmillan announced that he was standing down. This was before the Conservative Party elected their leaders, but there was A, quite a hiatus, and B, quite a surprise when Sir Alec Douglas Hume, then Lord Hume, until he renounced his peerage, to become Prime Minister, sit in the Commons and in a seat in Scotland. There's quite a hiatus about all of that. And I certainly remember my primary school teacher, who was kind of vaguely interested in politics. She used to spend Friday afternoons kind of chewing the cud as we were doing handicrafts or whatever. Small village school, and she certainly kind of was very fascinated by all of that. And then thereafter, I remember my parents allowed me to sit up and watch the first hour or so of the 1964 election coverage. And in those days, the polls closed at 9 o'clock. So, that meant I was allowed to stay up to 10, which is still pretty late by, I'm 1950 parents. So I remember watching it. And then, of course, it was actually very close. And we didn't know, in those days, quite a lot of the counting happened on the Friday. And I certainly remember following the count thereafter on the Friday. And eventually we discovered that Howard Wilson had an overall majority of about 3 or 4. So that kind of fascinated me and was interested. And I've been kind of following politics ever since. And then thereafter, so in my teenage years, I certainly remember reading A.J. Allen's The English Voter, which was one of the early survey-based studies of book-length studies of voting behaviour. And then thereafter, the first edition of Butler and Stokes' Political Change in Britain, which was based on the first academically directed survey of voting behaviour. This is data collected in 1963, 1964, and 1966. So my anorak tendencies were fairly early on, and that was the aspect of politics that, for whatever reason, interested me. And of course, Wilson's government between 66 and 70 was quite a dramatic one. We had the devaluation of the pound in 1967. We had the Labour government's attempt to reform the trade unions with in place of strife in 1969. It was the era of prices and incomes policies when government tried to control inflation by controlling both wages and prices. And that caused an awful lot of internal difficulty. So, there was plenty to follow. And as you can see, still plenty to remember.
Yeah.
That was my political education. I mean, then thereafter, I went to Oxford, did PPE, primarily focused on politics, did a paper which is called Political Sociology, which was where you could get closest to studying voting behaviour. And then I went on to do graduate work, and my supervisor was David Butler, who was, together with Robert Mackenzie, one of the 2 teledons of his age who did election night television for the BBC. And David was the person who introduced me to all of that in 1979 election, which of course happened rather suddenly because the Labour administration lost a vote of no confidence in the House, the first time a government had lost one since 1922. I was sat behind David in the studio, and my responsibility was to have a programmable calculator. In those days, you could have little handheld calculators which you could program, because this is in the days when most computers were still, it's before the days of the PC.
Yeah.
So we had mainframe computers, but not personal computers or anything portable. And shall we say that occasionally mainframe computers had a certain reputation for taking an unscheduled coffee break. And what David's particular role on the election night program was, as soon as the result had come in, is to say, well, the swing in Darlington was 3% from Conservative to Labour, and this is the highest or the lowest or whatever swing of the night, okay? So the point is that if the mainframe computer had broken down, he could no longer get this from the then very early screen service that was available. And historically, David had a whole load of graduate students with slide rules working all this out, okay? Anyway, programmable calculator by this stage. So my job in particular was to have that, and in general to be following the results and occasionally giving me advice, which he largely ignored. But as it happened on the night, although it had broken down during rehearsal, the mainframe computer did not break down, and to that extent at least, my programming proved to be redundant. But that was my first entry into television studio, and I've basically been involved in every election and virtually every local election ever since.
Did you have a plan at the time when you were sat behind David thinking, oh, I'd really like to be sat in his chair right now?
No. And of course, the truth is I have never done exactly that role. No, I mean, what happened then thereafter is that actually the person who used the mainframe computer to do the election forecast in BBC is a guy called Clive Payne. And he basically said to the BBC, this is 1982, so this is in the immediate wake of the rise of the Liberal SDP alliance, and then the impact of the Falklands War on all of that. And Clive, who was a computing officer at Oxford, had got a Research Machines 380Z, which is a very, very early quasi-portable personal computer. No great software. You had to be able to program it in BASIC. But Clive wrote a program that could ingest election results in terms of numbers and produce shares, change, and swing. And he said to the BBC, actually it was 1981 he first did this, the Greater London Assembly election, Greater London Council election. And he said to the BBC, if you collect the results, we'll get them into the Research Machines 380Z and we'll be able to provide you with an instant stats on the Greater London results. And then for 1982, we then did this for local elections. So that's how I then got involved in local elections. And then by 1983, and David by this time had been moved off to radio, Clive then said to the BBC, well, look, if you can get a feed of the results to the Oxford University computer, I've got this chap Curtice, he can use statistical software, and he will analyze the results using an acoustic coupler, which is basically putting a telephone into a device that enables you to talk to a computer many miles away, very, very slow speed, right? By today's standards. And I was then, and this is what I've largely done for the BBC ever since, is as results come in, providing instant analysis of what the results implied, were saying, etc. Over a long time, I was just doing this primarily by feeding lines to presenters, people like Anthony King in particular, and then and occasionally they might wheel me on at some point doing in the program. But so there, I think my experience is somewhat unusual, that I've worked for a very long time on effectively the production side of television, which is much more fascinating, much more powerful. And I've never wanted, if you ever watch the election programs, I'm not sitting in the middle of this spaceship, which is a television studio, where you are just utterly reliant on everybody around you. I'm basically still doing what I've always done, but what basically now BBC does is they put a camera in where I am, and occasionally therefore I can talk to the studio, but I'm never in the studio.
Interesting. That's
So that's the story,
Yeah.
basically. So it's a lot. It's a lot of, and the first academic that I wrote with, which was about the 1979 election, was a guy called Michael Steed, who was, apart from being an academic, particularly interested in the geography of voting behaviour, and that's what I wrote with him about. He was also an active politician inside the Liberal Party, and he and I, wrote about the geography of the 1979 election. We then discovered that, in fact, the way in which the electoral system was operating had changed fundamentally. And then along came the Liberal SDP alliance, and we wrote this analysis that effectively was a set of recommendations about how the Liberal Party and the SDP should divide the seats up between them, given that they were wanting to form an electoral pact. But then there was a whole row about how they should do this, and that got a lot of publicity. So I think my first appearance on Newsnight was explaining to Peter Snow or somebody what we were saying about the alliance. So the point was, and again, Michael was the kind of anonymous psephologist for The Economist. So you can see that my very, very early graduate education and contacts were basically with three people who in various ways had contact with the media and worked with the media, and therefore it became part of my DNA.
Yeah.
And the truth is, in those days, it's a relatively small group of people who were professional academics in the field, and virtually all of them in some way or another did some kind of external media work. It's now a much bigger community. Academic life's become, in some ways, much more insular. So the proportion of us who do it is now much smaller. But anyway,
I guess you always have the media knocking on your door nowadays as well. But
yeah, sure. I mean, I mean, there's nearly always somebody chasing me for something. And of course, this whole genre of podcasts has generated another whole a new way of doing things. And now, of course, they're not just audio, but as in this case, it's video as well. I think it's quite remarkable how, given the rise of social media and the decline of, you would think that audio broadcasting would be dead.
Yeah, radio seems to have come back, but it's called podcasting now.
Indeed, absolutely.
So just to touch on what you said previously about Michael being involved with the Lib Dems, that's never occurred to you then? It's never been something you'd want to do?
Definitely not.
Politics has always been something that other people do.
No, definitely not. No, it's you have to be able to dissemble in politics, and I prefer to try to give a straight answer to a straight question.
Yeah.
Which you're now going to test me on. Anyway.
So just to bring it up to the present day then, I wanted to talk about what we are seeing in the polls today. I mean, looking back over the past 50 years, you should be able to tell us whether or not this is quite an unprecedented situation, because it certainly feels like
we're in completely uncharted territory, at least so far as the GB polls are concerned. Not the Scottish polls to a degree, but nothing like the same extent.
So I'm just going to rattle off a few of the most recent figures that we've got. So from Ipsos last month, they had Reform. This is UK-wide, all UK-wide. They have Reform polling at 33%, Labour at 18%, the Tories on 16%, the Greens on 15%, and the Lib Dems on 12%. That's slightly higher numbers for Reform than YouGov got just the other day. They have Reform on 25%, then Labour on 19%.
This morning.
26
in YouGov this morning.
Oh,
I mean, basically, there have been 10 polling companies that have polled in November. And if you take the most recent poll that each of them has produced, and some of them are from earlier in the month, basically Reform at 30%. So Reform are down slightly, but they're still probably just north of at least out to the 30% mark, which has seemed to be, around which they've been bouncing. Labour have perhaps edged back up to 20%, but still 10 points behind. And the budget certainly hasn't done them any obvious good. 3 polls show no change. One shows 2-point increase. Tories are at 18%. The Greens, quite a lot of variation between the polls, but running at around 13-14%. And the Lib Dems actually now running last at about 12%. But the crucial point is the combined level of support for Conservative and Labour is running at less than 40%. This is an all-time low. The nearest was to this was the spring of 2019, when certainly both Conservative and Labour were in a weak position, but not as weak as they are now. And this is, and Reform have now been ahead in the polls since April. And that means, although their share is less than the Alliance were ever getting, the Alliance basically only ever managed to be ahead in the polls for about 5 months in the end of 1981, early 1982. So we've now got a party other than Labour, Lib Dem, or Conservative being ahead in the polls for longer than has ever previously been the case. My view is, and this has been my view really ever since the 2024 election, is that the question, well, one of the many questions with which British politics is faced, is whether or not we are looking at the end of the two-party system as we have known it. That system, of course, had already been effectively destroyed in Scotland by the 2014 independence referendum, but it was still alive in England and Wales. But it always seemed to me since the summer of last year that was a potential question facing British politics, because even in the 2024 election, less than 60% of people voted Conservative or Labour amongst those who voted in what was a low turnout election. And that was the lowest at any election since and including 1922, which is the first election when Labour displaced the Liberal Party as the principal challenger to the Conservatives. So that question was hanging over us, and there were all sorts of reasons as to believe that the challenge could be that would emerge post-election would be quite substantial, because the Conservatives' reputation had been very, very heavily tarnished by its perceived record between 2019 and 2024. So it seemed unlikely that they would come back anytime soon. The Labour Party's electoral victory, or despite the parliamentary landslide, was very thin. 35% of the vote is the lowest share of the vote for any party with an overall majority, let alone one with a majority of 170. Labour had failed in what it argued was its crucial objective in 2019 to 2024, on which Deborah Mattison was certainly, I heard repeat only a few days ago, which was to reconnect in particular with working class voters. Labour's vote is no higher amongst working class voters than it is amongst middle class voters. That was true in 2019. It was still true in 2024. So the demographic anchor, and the same is true of the Tories, right? It doesn't make a difference. So the demographic anchor of our two-party politics has disappeared. What's also clear is that the dimensionality of politics in England has changed. Politics in England is no longer just about left versus right, by which I mean an argument about whether or not society is too unequal and the state should be trying to do something about it, or whether the state should be trying to focus, which is the classic left-wing argument, or should the state be focusing on trying to create the circumstances in which entrepreneurs and businesses will want to invest. We therefore get economic growth from which everybody will benefit. That's the classic right-of-centre argument. Politics is now also about, there are various terms for it. It's essentially about culture wars. It's about social liberals versus social conservatives. It's those people who are concerned about immigration, who are skeptical about equalities policies, think that society should be imposing its moral code, think that everybody should be feeling British, and we shouldn't be apologising for Britain's past. These are folk who think that social cohesion is crucial in a society and that a society should be working to achieve that, as opposed to social liberals who say, no, look, in the end, what moral code is up to you. It should be imposed by the state. It should be women's right to choose. For example, they think that equalities policies are important. They don't really care whether you speak English or not, whether or not you acknowledge the Union flag, what you think about the monarchy, and certainly don't think, and certainly will be willing to question Britain's past. So all these arguments have now become as important in determining how people vote as is the left-right argument. And this is not unique to the United Kingdom. You can see it in Trump's America. You can see it in the populist right in Europe. But in the UK, Brexit particularly fast-forwarded this process, because how people voted in the Brexit referendum was unrelated to whether they were on the left or on the right. What it was very strongly related to was whether you were social liberal or social conservative. We were arguing about immigration and about sovereignty. These are culture wars issues. They are not left-right issues. So Brexit meant this second dimension it already had some importance, became much more important. So, for example, Labour's vote now is very clearly much higher amongst social liberals than amongst social conservatives. If you go back to the beginning of this century, that second dimension made virtually no difference at all to your probability of voting Labour. But above all, it primarily defines reform voters. Reform voters are almost universally social or conservatives. It's also, together with left versus right, it heavily defines green voters as well. So the point, therefore, is, however, whether you're on the left or on the right doesn't determine whether you're a social liberal or a social conservative. Think of the Home Secretary. Sabina Mahmood is economically left, but is socially conservative. And therefore, it's much more difficult to maintain a two-party system if you've got two separate ideological dimensions structuring voting behaviour. And therefore, parties like Liberal Democrats, who have always been about the second dimension, Reform, who are about the second dimension, are attracting voters through that second dimension. And it makes it much more difficult for Conservative and Labour to create a broad coalition. So these were all the structural changes that meant that the two-party system was facing a challenge. And then you have a Labour government, which people were going, we don't know what they stand for, led by a prime minister who has never been popular. And who has always crucially above all, and it links these two things, has never had a story to tell about what kind of Britain he wants to create. If Keir Starmer's argument in the election, which has changed, but changed to what, was essentially, I am going to reverse the damage that I claim the Tories have caused to the economy, to public services, and the way that they've got immigration out of control. That was his pitch. But it was all about correcting the errors of the past, not about projecting a vision of the future. And then, of course, what was true the summer of last year, this is a government facing a very, very substantial policy challenge, because Labour was saying we're going to achieve economic growth and that will get us out of the severe fiscal bind we're in, whereby public spending is higher than it has been, is as high as it has been in the post-war era, a legacy of the pandemic, the energy crisis, etc. But Labour were very optimistic about how quickly they could achieve the economic growth that will enable us to get out of the fact that our fiscal finances are constrained, but we seem to have very high, increasing levels of demand for spending on public services. Getting the health service turned around was going to be difficult. Stopping the boats, arguably an impossible exercise. And that, therefore, there was always the question. So given the thinness of its electoral base, given those structural changes, and given the circumstances in which Labour came to power, and given the apparent lack of political direction being provided by Starmer, where would voters go if indeed they lost confidence in this Labour government? Well, the answer has been, they lost confidence very rapidly in this government. No previous government has lost support so quickly, no newly elected government has lost support so quickly, so early in its life. And where have they gone? Well, actually, in Labour's case, they've scattered to the four winds. So some of them have gone to Reform. That, by the way, is particularly a problem for Labour north of the border. But some of them have gone to the Greens and to Liberal Democrats. And so therefore, Labour are struggling to work out, well, which group should we try to appeal to? And meanwhile, and this is something that's out of Labour's hands, but again underlines the difficulty of the Conservatives, Reform are just eating the Conservative Party alive. And the thing above all, well, there are two things about where we are at the moment in British politics. Two things you need to know, and then you really understand the difficulties that the opposition party have. The first is that a majority of people who voted for the Conservatives in 2019 are now backing reform. And secondly, that a majority, about 54%, of people who voted for Brexit in 2016 are voting for reform. Right. And that's how reform have basically corralled. It's a niche market. It's probably a market which is going to be difficult to move much above the 30% mark. And that's roughly where they've been stalled at for quite some time. But given the fragmentation of our politics into 5 parties, because again, the 2024 election was the first election in British history in which 5 parties fought virtually everywhere across Great Britain, which means in Scotland and Wales, 6 parties. Right? So our politics have become much more fragmented. So you can see why we are in very, very different circumstances. And we frankly, none of us knows where it's going, but it so happens it looks as though there is a perfect storm of long-term structural change to do with demography and the illogical basis of politics, which is then interacting with short-term contingent factors, the current difficulties of the British state, the loss of confidence in the British loss of confidence amongst the public in the ability of the British state to turn things around. And that's not an SNP point. It's not confined to Scotland. This is something that's felt across the UK. And the fact that the current political leadership of the Labour Party is weak, that of the Conservative Party is learning how to do the job, although she's getting a bit better. And you have at the 2 ends of the spectrum 2 very charismatic politicians, one Nigel Farage, now long since established his charisma, but then much more recently Zach Polanski for the Greens of England and Wales.
So we've covered a lot of ground there. So coming up with questions as we went through, but just on reform, kind of hitting this 30% ceiling, I've heard just anecdotally commentators and stuff saying reform are getting support from people who've never voted before, have never turned out to vote before. Does that
Well,
stand up?
we don't know whether they've never voted before, but 1 or 2 of the polling companies, though only 1 or 2 of them, do report the level of support for the parties amongst those who did not vote in 2024, which of course was a substantial body. I mean, I actually, once you take into account the level of postal voting, by my calculations, the 2024 election is the first election in our history in which less than half the electorate actually physically went to the polling stations to vote. But anyway, and overall, it was,
People are getting more and more used to doing things on their phone.
Well, no, not necessarily. But I mean, the point is that we do now have a quite substantial postal vote, somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 votes of vote by post. And there's quite a big spike in Scotland because the election took place in July, and people were on holiday. But it's certainly the polling evidence such as we have suggests that reform are well ahead, like running at about 50%. Amongst those people who did not vote in 2024. So there is certainly something to that story, that reform do seem to be able to reach out to people who have hitherto at least not necessarily been regular voters.
And you spoke also about this kind of second dimension to politics where it's more culture war rather than policy. Like, do you want immigrants coming into the country? Do you want union flags on your roundabouts, or do you not want, or do you want immigrants coming in and you don't want union flags on your roundabouts, whatever it might be? It seems that from reform, from Conservatives, from Labour, we're hearing a very similar narrative. Yes, please, Keir Starmer, I have an England flag hanging in my living room, I think he said. Well, he did say that. It seems like they're all aiming at the same kind of pot of voters. Is that side of things, the traditionally maybe more right side of things, like no to immigration, yes to union flags, is that a much bigger pot of voters than the other side?
Yes and no. So let's unravel a bit. The Conservative Party, immigration is a central part of reform's message. And concerned both about its culture and economic consequences. One of the things you need to know about Leave voters is that they now feel many of them now feel that uh, immigration to the UK is higher as a result of Brexit, which of course was complete opposite of what they anticipated. Um, and the truth is the UK has experienced record levels of immigration. And historically, we are a country that was a net exporter of people. Um, that began to turn around around the turn of the century. We had a whole row about asylum seekers 20 years ago. Um, and we've basically been running at around 200,000 a year typically, which is now what we've got back down to. Um, but we have become, a net importer, having historically been a net exporter. So we shouldn't be surprised that there is concern about immigration. And I think, the broadest part of of reforms appeal is going to be about immigration. So there will be people who are on the anti-Brexit side of the argument, who are not necessarily particularly socially conservative, who will still be saying, well, we're not that keen on the levels of immigration we've been experiencing, and who certainly, I mean, there clearly is a sharp distinction in a lot of people's minds between, um, what I loosely call asylum seekers. Of course, in practice, the people who come across the English Channel on boats are a minority of asylum seekers. But they're a significant chunk of them, and they're the visible chunk. And so there certainly is a very widespread feeling that that is something that needs to be brought under control, rightly or wrongly. But more broadly, I would say to you that, given that Brexit is, as it were, it's the litmus paper of reform support, because Brexit is how you voted on Brexit and how you would vote now on Brexit does give you a pretty good idea where you are on the social liberal, social conservative spectrum. Support for Brexit is probably, if you include the don't know as a denominator, depends a bit by pollster, and there's only two of them at the moment who's running it, but it's probably running at no more than about 40%. You're never going to get all of them. So therefore, once you're getting much above 30% is going to be difficult, particularly because I think one of the things that's interesting about reform is that its message about immigration is primarily about the perceived cultural consequences. It says what it doesn't seem to be, and that means it taps in very much to an older people, who many of them are people who are basically expressing not just the fact that in the recent past there's been a lot of immigration. Oh, and of course, as post-Brexit, our immigration is much more ethnically and racially diverse than it was when we were inside the European Union. But also, I think, are reacting against the fact that Britain has become a much more diverse society during the course of the last 50 years. That what reform are not succeeding doing in the way that some of the populist right parties are doing so in Europe, or indeed Trump is doing in the US, is to appeal to the economic discontents of younger people. You won't appeal to younger people so much on cultural grounds because they are much less concerned. So, so one reason to feel it's a niche market is because what is the level of support for Brexit? You use that as your litmus test. The other reason, the other way I would articulate is this: at the end of the day, of course, what's happened is that Britain has become a much more socially liberal society, probably particularly so during the course of the last 10, 15 years. And that, we are now, more broadly speaking, transgender accepted. This is the thing that's gone in the opposite direction. But we've become much more liberal on abortion. We've become much more liberal on promoting the rights of people from minority backgrounds. Our attitudes now towards same-sex relationship is, what's the problem? It's only just over 20 years ago that we moved from being a society where more people thought it was wrong than thought it was, there was nothing to it, to changing our minds. It's a very, very recent but very substantial social change. So there are lots of ways in which as a society we've become much more liberal. Of course, rights of women being involved in the labour market, including women at a younger age. And one of the ways I would characterise what reform are getting at, it's not the Reformation, it's the Counter-Reformation. These are the folk who are unhappy about some of the cultural changes that have happened in our society and have happened during their lifetime, and which they are finding it difficult to accommodate to. It is, to use the classic phrase, this is not the country I was brought up in. And that's what Farage seems to be able to appeal to. It was much the community that voted for Leave back in 2016. And it's still a crucial and important part of our. So Keir Starmer is now beginning to talk about Brexit. He's finally going some courage. I mean, the other point you were making was, so that's the size of the community. Now, yes, Reform, that's their community. The Conservatives, given what I've told you about the fact that Reform are primarily taking votes off them, they want to win it back. And of course, they presided over a record level of immigration. It was the Conservatives who liberalised the immigration rules for non-EU citizens, the great irony of our time. And that's why we've now got much higher level of migration from outside the EU. And they feel that they made a mistake and they try to reconnect with their voters. In the case of Labour, I mean, given that Starmer wanted, as I said earlier, to reconnect with working class voters, in particular, Labour under Starmer wanted to reconnect with pro-Leave working class voters whom they felt were responsible for the symbolic loss of the so-called red wall seats in 2019 because of so therefore ever since, Starmer has always been there with the Union flag, etc., and promoting patriotism. And it's why you can see why somebody might end up writing a speech for Keir Starmer that talks in terms about immigration that perhaps was rather too close to the language. The language that Enoch Powell used back in the late 1960s. Now, because Labour have, and why perhaps Labour have been quicker to react to their loss of support to Reform than they have to the loss of support to Greens, because it's been their strategy forever under Starmer to be trying to reconnect with socially conservative Britain. They didn't succeed for the most part in 2024, but that doesn't mean to say that their immediate reaction is to try. So that helps to explain why Labour where they are. Now, in the case of the Greens, they just basically putting themselves at the opposite end of the spectrum. And Ed Davey is reasonably happy also about doing that as well.
Yeah, so
as is John Swinney, of course.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, but I guess well, as you said, it's like a historic fall off from their election to hitting these really, really low approval ratings for the Labour government. Is there any way they can pull this back? Is there any precedent in these numbers?
Well, there is no precedent. I've already told you.
Yeah, but if
we are in uncharted territory, but the point about uncharted territory, there are no maps to tell us where we go. No, I mean, clearly, one possibility is that we are going through the 1920s again, and that perhaps, because this is Nigel Farage's stated ambition, he said he would only go back into politics if he thought he could achieve this ambition, that maybe Reform will displace the Conservative Party, either directly or perhaps partly in the end through a joining together in which Reform are the dominant element. We recreate a two-party system, which is one that perhaps is Labour versus Reform, with again the Democrats still kicking around, rather than a Labour versus Conservative one. And so in the 1920s, we saw the party of the left, quote unquote, change, and maybe now we're going to see the party of the right change. The other possibility is that we are indeed going to live in an era of fragmented politics. Because of that ideological fragmentation that I've talked about, there is space for the Greens on the socially liberal left. Although Reform may not remain at their current levels of support, there is always going to be room for a socially conservative party that kind of wants to reduce the role of government, and that the space left for the centre is going to be reduced. I mean, I think the only other thing I would say to you is this: is that if you look at most of the party systems of much of what we used to call Western Europe, France, Spain, Germany, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands. These have all experienced fundamental changes in their party systems during the course of the last 20 years or so. Macron was a completely new party. Italy used to be the Christian Democrats versus the communists. That's all gone. Germany was dominated by the Christian Democrats versus the Social Democrats. Well, then the Greens came along, and the FDP is still occasionally are there. But now, of course, we've got the AfD, and we ever since unification, we've had De Linke. Look at the Netherlands, complete transformation. So you'll have to ask yourself and given that some of the reasons are similar. The challenge to the state caused by the financial crash, the way in which younger people are finding it more difficult to have confidence in their economic futures, the cultural challenges to Europe created by immigration, the geostrategic situation, etc., etc. Why should Britain's two-party system be immune?
So in Britain, just one final thing, UK-wide, before we maybe take it a bit more Scottish focused. But is the Westminster system, the first past the post election system, does that create pressures that kind of create a two-party system that mean, as you said, maybe Reform and the Tories are more likely to form together into some kind of reform-led element?
It creates a logic, but the logic can work in two ways. So, I think the first thing one needs to understand, a single member plurality, first past the post, will always treat a party with a geographically evenly spread vote that comes third harshly. But that same party, if it comes first, will be treated generously. Just look at the history of the SNP, right? Historically, particularly for Westminster elections, struggled to get much more than half a dozen seats. Vote geographically evenly spread, even post the collapse of the Tories after Black Wednesday, and the SNP became the second party in Scotland, still struggled to get much more than that. Then along comes 2015, nearly 50% of the vote, geographically evenly spread. Well, it was just one seat left for each of the three unionist parties. Otherwise, the SNP went walkies, right? And we'll come back to what this is going to be relevant to 2026 in a moment. So equally, therefore, Reform at 15% with a geographically evenly spread vote, as in 2024, get very little reward. Indeed, fundamental to appreciate, Reform at 15% were a crucial foundation of the Labour landslide and the Liberal Democrats' record representation at Westminster, because it was Reform who primarily took votes off the Conservatives, reduced the Conservative share of the vote in many constituency, and that, together with some tactical switching amongst the remaining anti-Conservative vote, enabled Labour and the Democrats to pick up these enormous pile of seats on, in both cases, relatively low shares of the vote. But Reform at 30% and ahead with a geographically evenly spread vote, the system works to their advantage. And we saw that in the county council elections in England at the beginning of May. Now, at the moment, there's a lot of speculation about tactical switching, and maybe this will force recreate two-party system. Well, certainly we may well get some tactical voting, but whether it will generate a two-party system at the national level, well, first of all, that will only work if voters in most constituencies feel that their constituency has the same top two parties as every other constituency. And one of the things that happened in the wake of 2024 is it's only a minority of constituencies now, again for the first time, where Conservative and Labour, for example, share first and second place. The second thing to be aware of, and this is buried in the depths of the so-called multiple regression and post-stratification polling that is still being done. These are these big polls that try to tell you what the outcome would be in seats. And the secret of them, and the thing that they did well in 2024, although they overestimated Labour's level of support, what they did capture very well was the geographical variation in the change in party support. And the thing you also have to know is that at the moment, With the Conservative Party losing another 25% or so of its vote, the Conservative vote is going down more heavily in that relatively small number of 120 constituencies that they currently hold, arithmetically almost inevitable. And Labour, which have lost nearly half their support from 2024, their vote is very definitely going down more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. So the risk actually is, at the moment, you can create a scenario where unless the tactical voting gets coordinated across constituencies, single member plurality could speed up the decline of the two-party system rather than act as an insulating bulwark.
Interesting. That is interesting. So I just had a look at the time, and time is flying. I did not realize how much time we had spent already. So yeah, let's talk about Scotland in 2026.
Yep.
Well, I say Scotland, also Wales is looking like it's going to be really, really important
Sure.
next year, the elections. One thing that I guess ties in what we were saying that I think looks like a possibility. You can tell me if I'm wrong or not. We have Reform polling in second place in both Scotland and Wales. The most recent
No. Well, Wales, the polling is not entirely consistent, but if you take the average of the polls, Reform are running first. For Westminster, Reform are running second in Scotland, but for Holyrood, it's nip and tuck between them and Labour as to who's second and who's third.
Oh, I had.
If you take the average of the polls,
Oh, fair enough.
and again, and I
I
think
will defer.
and I think one of the things to realise, however, is that we've not really had any polling in Scotland since the arrival of Zach Polanski down south, and whether or not that is going to do anything to the position north of the border or not.
Yeah, kind of. Even though he's not really affiliated with the
No,
state
but
group,
the point
so.
is, people in Scotland still get the messages from down south.
Yeah.
That at the moment they are probably, with all due respect to Ross Greer and Gillian Martin, his co-leader, they're probably seeing more of Zach Polanski at the moment.
Yeah, Mackay. But yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, I think the Greens are talking about possibly winning their first constituency at the next election. I think it's probably going to be a little bit bittersweet that they may well do it, but it might be the English Greens leader that is
Helping them out.
the driving force behind it. But could we end up in a situation then, whether or not Reform at 1 point ahead of Blood or 1 point behind them, and here in Scotland, if they're battling with Labour for second place, but could we end up with a position where Reform are, like the Tories were at the last election, saying, if you support the Union, if you want a stronger United Kingdom, vote for us. A vote for the Tories, a vote for Labour is a wasted vote. The SNP will take all the pro-independence votes, and we end up with this situation that we had back in 2021, where if you're a yes supporter, your vote is going to go to the SNP. The two were very, very closely tied, and I think you've spoken before about how that's since been broken. And
But it has on the nationalist side, not on the union side.
So could we end up in a situation where tactical voting, as we've said, and if you're a yes supporter, if you support independence, then you're like, okay, SNP, sorry Greens, sorry Alpa, but I have to go for the big party. And if you're on the unionist side, then you feel a pressure to back Reform in order to give that unionist.
Well, it depends on whether or not Reform could convince voters that they are better able than Labour or the Conservatives to defeat the SNP locally. I mean, the first point one should make is to bear in mind that there is already quite a lot of tactical voting in the 2021 baseline. It was pretty clear in 2021 that voters in some constituencies, Jackie Bailey's seat, for example, they're voting Labour. Elsewhere, because the Tories are doing quite well, they tried voting Conservatives. And what you can also see in 2024 is that tactical vote did switch from the Tories to Labour. Right? That's, again, very, very clearly what's going on, though that, as I'll explain in a moment, is one of the reasons why Reform is now a problem for Labour north of the border. So, therefore, yes, there could well be quite a lot of tactical voting, but if there isn't some tactical voting, actually the position will be better from the SNP than it would otherwise be the case, because it's already there in the baseline, right? Okay. But, and of course, what could also be true is if indeed the polls continue to show Labour and Reform, nip and tuck with each other, is that voters will simply end up being confused as to who they should vote for locally, right? And again, because we've got different constituencies from Westminster, uh, not that easy necessarily to work out where, if anywhere, reform might be a serious threat to the SNP, right?
think-
Okay.
Did-
So
Did that happen a little bit in Stephen Flynn's seat in the last general election, where he did win, but if the Unionist parties had all kind of added together, then he would have been displaced, and it was a case of
sure.
who do you tactically
Right, yeah,
vote
sure.
for?
Yeah, sure. That, I mean, that can be a problem. But for the most part, I mean, what happened in 2024 is that, one of the reasons why Labour did as well as they did in terms of seats is that apart from those places, so in the seats where the Conservatives were clearly the competitors to the SNP. So, that's, for example, in the Northeast.
Yeah.
So there's about half, there were about, the half dozen the seats the Tories had, and a few where the Tories were really relatively close to the SNP. For the most part, the tactical vote seemed to stick with the Conservative Party. Elsewhere, even though Labour might be have been third in 2019, the Unionist vote, the tactical Unionist vote, seemed to switch to Labour last year. Right. Okay. So again, how that will play out in terms of change since 2021, quite complicated. But we also know in 2021 that people were voting tactically. So is it something the SNP have to worry about? Yes, of course, almost undoubtedly. One of the things the SNP will be trying to do in the opposite direction is, well, A, to try to persuade the Green Party not to stand too much in the first place, but B, if they do, to squeeze their vote, at least in the constituency vote. And, and the experience of the Greens, for example, in Mother Glen was not that happy. And you can see there's about 1 in 10 current Yes supporters who are saying they're going to vote for the Greens on the constituency vote. And that must be John Sweeney's key target, number one. Yes, tactical voting is an important consideration, but at the end of the day, what Reform have done, they've split the Unionist vote. Okay, so virtually nobody who voted SNP in 2024, a diminished band as though they were, we should acknowledge that, but virtually nobody who voted for the SNP last year have now switched to Reform. In contrast, Reform are picking up, yes, it's votes primarily from the Tories, but also quite heavily from Labour. It's running at about 18% north of the border, whereas it's about 12% across the UK as a whole. And that is a consequence of the fact, well, Labour's vote in Scotland is less left-wing, and the fact that Labour in Scotland were relatively much more successful in picking up votes from the Tories last year than they were elsewhere in the UK. Again, not least because of those tactical anti-SNP voting. That means that Labour are more vulnerable to direct switching to Reform north of the border. And you can see that being played out in the polls. So therefore, the Unionist vote's just been fragmented, which therefore means although the SNP are, in terms of Westminster voting intentions, 32, barely any more than they got last year. Holyrood, a bit better, 35. Still well down on the 47, 48% that they got in 2021, but geographically evenly spread vote. Double-digit lead. The same logic as for Reform south of the border. The vast bulk, the majority of seats for Holyrood elected through first past the post, and the SNP at 35, and both Labour and Reform running at 17 or 18. I mean, basically half the total, right? Yeah. Does point to the SNP being potentially, you're right, this is where the tactical voting matters. It's where perhaps the fact that some SNP MPs are not standing again, they might lose their personal vote. The majorities we're talking about are not necessarily large ones, much like many of Labour's majorities last year were. But they could at least potentially get around the 55, 56, 57 seat mark. Getting a majority, very, very difficult, and probably having fewer seats than they have at the moment. But given that the Greens, even before Polanski, look as though they might be heading for their best list vote yet, That potentially, therefore, means the disproportionality of the first past the post element for Holyrood, which the list element will not be big enough to correct, means that there is a good chance that there will be a pro-independence majority in the next Holyrood Parliament. We now all know that having a pro-independence majority is not a sufficient condition for another independence referendum, but it is a necessary condition. And the point is, the independence debate remains on the table if there is still a pro-independence majority at Holyrood. And then if we do get a fragmented Westminster Parliament after 2029, in which at some point the SNP perhaps have crucial leverage, at least it is potentially game on. But that's where we seem to. So it's the electoral system that's crucial. We are talking about the SNP, because people kind of say to me, I had a conversation only this morning, saying, oh, surely not the SNP aren't going to survive again. And I kind of gradually had to explain, no, of course they're not like as popular as they were. They have lost a lot of ground since Nicola Sturgeon resigned. But Labour's votes also collapsed, and ergo, given the electoral system, at the moment, they look to be in a very strong position. And, it's again, it's a familiar story, right? Yeah. Reform at 15%, good news for Keir Starmer. Reform at 17%, good news for the SNP. Don't want them any higher, but at 17%, they'll take that.
I was going to draw that comparison as well. It seems like what was very, very good for Keir Starmer a year and a half ago now is going to be very, very bad for him in May 2026.
Sure.
Potentially. I mean, you said there's a good chance that we'll have a pro-independence majority at Holyrood after next year's elections.
Yeah.
I think there's a pretty solid chance that Plaid will lead the Welsh government after next year.
Well, that's all. That is all. Well, I mean, we should just say very quickly about Wales. The polling is even sparser than it is here, and it's also somewhat contradictory, right? They disagree about how badly Labour is doing, and whether or not it's Plaid that are first or Reform that are first. I mean, this is why the Caerphilly by-election was of such interest, because in a sense we were looking to see, given this apparently contradictory evidence, is it really the case that Labour could be heading for third and perhaps a poor third place in Wales, and it would be the first election lost since 1931? And is it indeed a battle between Reform and Plaid for first place? I think Caerphilly told us that at least is the world we are in at the moment, although I think one should also be aware that the gap between Labour and Plaid is around, on average, 6-7 points. It's not such a big gap that it's impossible for Labour maybe to reverse the position, the relative position. But the crucial point is that although Reform might come first, it looks very, very unlikely that they can get a First Minister elected, because maybe the Tories will vote for them. But unless Labour were to deliberately sit on their hands and allow a Reform First Minister to be elected, and then the political fallout from that, I think, might be more than Labour might be confident, even though you might want to say, oh, we'd love to see Reform in power and then see them foul up and all the rest of it. It would be just a wee bit too Machiavellian for their own good, right? So therefore, I suspect what's true is that even if Plaid are the second largest party, that Labour, basically the roles of the two parties will reverse, and whereas hitherto, in the last 25 years, Plaid have at various occasions played handmaiden in various roles to the Labour administration, the roles will be reversed. But of course, what it would mean, assuming that John Swinney is still First Minister, which seems a reasonable bet, even if the SNP don't do quite as well as we might anticipate at the moment, it does mean we will have a Nationalist First Minister in Edinburgh, a Nationalist First Minister in Cardiff, and of course we will definitely have a Nationalist First Minister in Belfast, because Michelle O'Neill is not facing the election. This is not what devolution was meant to be about.
That's what I was going to say. If we do end up with 3 pro-independence First Ministers and a UK government desperately trying to hold it together, is that something Keir Starmer can survive?
Well, I mean, whether or not Keir Starmer can survive will depend on the reaction of his party to, if indeed Labour, don't do much in Scotland, but certainly if they were to become a poor third in Wales. And then I think also probably the other place to watch is London, which we should now be aware is the place where Labour are strongest as a party. Our geography has fundamentally changed. I mean, the idea that Labour Party is a party of the north of England and the Midlands, it's yesterday's story. Let alone the idea of Labour Party being a party of Scotland. Or indeed, I mean, even in Wales, its share of the vote fell last election. It's barely any higher than that. It was barely higher than it was in England. It is London. It is London. That is Labour's core area. I mean, I argue that basically Labour's core electorate now is young middle class professionals living in London. But that's where the Greens, that's their constituency they're appealing to. It's first past the post, whole council, multi-member wards. An awful lot of wards could change hands. Not, I think, reform, apart from some of the outer boroughs, won't be significant, but it will be inner London, much of the rest of London. It's how much damage do the Greens do, either directly or indirectly, by either taking seats and or votes off Labour. Labour do badly in London, it will be big headlines. And then, of course, on top of that, we do have a lot of other. And one of the things we didn't really have last year, apart from Doncaster, was very much in the way of local elections in parts of England which are traditional Labour territory, but leave voting, and where Labour's vote may have been long-term decline, to see how much damage reform do there. That's what's going to determine Keir Starmer's fate, and then whether or not the party then decide that they have to get rid of him. It won't be the alignment of the three nationalist first ministers.
Not the stars aligning.
But of course, it does create an I mean, there already clearly were sometimes coordination between the Welsh government under Labour and the SNP government here about adopting a joint position vis-a-vis the UK government.
Very often during devolution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it will just become it will just go a wee bit easier, and maybe they sometimes will persuade Belfast to join in the game as well.
Yeah. No, but I guess it will also be easier for the central government to dismiss them, because it'll just be, they're just nationalists causing trouble. Whereas when it was the Welsh government under Mark Drakeford, it was much harder to say that.
Maybe.
But if you were a betting man, would you bet on Keir Starmer fighting the next general election?
I don't think I'd want to put any money on him doing so. No, but I'm not. But I'm not a betting man.
Yeah.
I think, or put it like this: I think I'd want reasonably good odds.
Yeah, fair enough. I feel like we've gone on for longer than I meant to keep you here. So, and we've covered an awful lot of ground. So I won't plumb too much further. I guess we have just almost touched on this. So just one final question. You spoke previously about the general election, there being this kind of crucial pro-yes minority ever since the detachment of the SNP vote and the pro-independence vote, that kind of...
Yeah, but we're running a 50-50 society. It hasn't changed in 6 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the people that support independence that aren't necessarily going to vote SNP,
Yes.
are they going to be, as you've described them previously, are they going to be crucial to next year's general election?
Yeah. I mean, look,
Holyrood election.
if you want to understand John Sweeney's tactics, right? Okay.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Right, okay, right.
His secret plan, please.
So why is John Swinney saying to yes voters, if you want independence, you have to vote for the SNP? Well, point one is the days when the SNP can pick up significant shares of the vote from those who are opposed to independence in the way they did in 2011. The foundation of their success in 2011 was support from nearly 40% of those who were opposed to independence, right? Those days are over. Very few unionists are willing to vote for the SNP. So therefore, he has to focus on the other half of the country, right? And of course, he doesn't want, I mean, like any party politician, he doesn't want he doesn't want to go around saying, of course it's fine if you want to vote for Alva or the Greens, so long as you're part of the broad nationalist family, that's going to be fine. No, of course not. John Swinney is very, very keen to get to a parliamentary position where he doesn't have to negotiate too much with other parties to be able to run the next administration. And at the moment, given where the polls are at the moment, it looks as though the prospect he faces is either having to strike deals with the Greens or with the Democrats. Probably everybody else will be unbiddable or will be persona non grata, i.e. reform, and that therefore his options are going to be quite limited, and both those parties are going to potentially have quite a lot of bargaining power. The closer the SNP can get to 65, the greater, the easier it will be to run an administration, and the less bargaining power the Greens and the Democrats may have. But of course, and of course, setting out the objective majority, it so happens the geography does, while it can get him to 55, getting to 65, which has to be done virtually wholly through first past the post seats, is very, very difficult. That doesn't mean to say he doesn't want to get as many votes as possible. He certainly wants the 10% or so of people who are supporting the Greens. He would love to get the 10% or so of yes supporters that are backing Labour, because that is the pathway to him maximising his parliamentary position at Holyrood. And at the end of the day, all party leaders want to maximise their own support.
Yeah. Is that his secret plan? Have you?
Yeah, that's all he's doing. But the reason why, therefore, he wasn't saying, let's have the 1,000 independence flowers bloom, and we don't care if people vote for the Greens over on the list or whatever, or we should have some broad campaign. No, of course not. He's about trying to hang on to power.
Yeah.
Right?
No. Yeah, bro. Will it be the 5th term? Losing count. 5th. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
5th term.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. On that note, we will wrap up because I'm aware that we've been keeping you an extremely long time. I'm very sorry, but it's very interesting. It's hard to stop listening. But thanks. Hopefully everybody listening at home feels the same. It's not just me. But thank you so much for joining us today, Professor John Curtice, and for everybody at home as well. If you're watching on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you might get your podcast, please like and subscribe. It really helps us. And yes, tune in next time for another edition of the National Podcast. Thank you very much.